Welcome to MSD 014 Ecological Economics. Session is on ecosystem services and its valuation. We will be learning about valuation and pricing of natural resources. In this session, we are going to discuss about ecosystem goods and services, reasons why we value ecosystem goods and services, and we'll also be trying to understand the definitions, example, advantages and disadvantages of ecosystem economics and ecosystem valuation. Now, before we dive into ecosystem economics and valuation topics, we need to understand what is an ecosystem. Now, according to UN Convention of Biological Diversity, the dynamic complex of plant, animal and microorganisms and its communities, along with different abiotic and non-living environment interacting as a functional unit, is called as an ecosystem. We have to note that this definition is independent of the spatial scale because ecosystems are inevitably interconnected or overlapping. They are never like standing in isolation, so they are always interdependent or interacting with nearby ecosystem. Thus, the scale of analysis also depends on the relationship we want to study, which for ecosystem accounting is primarily the relationship that tries to explore the flows between ecosystems and societies. Now, what are the ecosystem assets that we are going to value in this approach? So, the spatial area comprises of different characteristics that are fundamental to analysis of ecosystem. Now, these ecosystem assets or these characteristics are stocks and exchanges in stocks that are measured by two important perspectives: ecosystem condition and ecosystem extent. Now, the second one is operational characteristic of an economic ecosystem asset. Now, these are first the structure or food web, second composition of ecosystem. So, these are biotic and abiotic components. Third is the process, which kind of process we want to understand as an ecosystem asset. For example, photosynthesis, photorespiration, biogeochemical cycles and so on and so forth. Then we talk about the next one, that function. It talks about different functions of ecosystem that are assets. For example, resilience. The resilience of an ecosystem is an important asset of an ecosystem. Now, we also try to understand the contrast with individual resources of this approach. With this, we move to ecosystem services. So, what are the ecosystem services? So, ecosystem services are the contributions of ecosystems to benefit used in economic and other human activity. Contributions because ecosystem services can be combined with other inputs, for example, economic infrastructure to provide benefits. In some cases also, the contributions may be equivalent to the benefits. That means where there are negligible other inputs. We also need to understand not all flows from the environment are ecosystem services. For example, it excludes extracted or extractable minerals. It also excludes the presence of human beneficiaries that are necessary. Now, we know that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment 2005 was the first that gave the concept of ecosystem services. It further segregated it into four important ecosystem services. So, these are provisioning benefits that includes food, water, wood and timber, fuel wood, NTFPs or non-timber forest produces. Second is regulating the climate regulation by ecosystem, flood regulation, disease regulation, the carbon stocks, the water purification potential that are kept under this category. Third one is cultural. So, under this, these are our psychological benefits, aesthetic benefits, religious benefits, spiritual benefits and educational benefits. and overall support to 3 of these important prime ecosystem services are supported by supporting ecosystem services. That includes biogeochemical processes, nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, and so on and so forth. So what does it help to? Now, one of the most important aspect is ecosystem services ensure, and they are constituent of human well-being. So that means they ensure security, they also ensure basic material for good life, they also ensure health, because good environment and better flow of ecosystem ensure health. They also provide good social relations and freedom of choice and action to carry an opportunity to be able to achieve what an individual values are and doing of human well-being. Now moving to the next aspect and conceptual framework of ecosystem services. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework 2005 was replaced by Intergovernmental Panel of Biodiversity of Ecosystem Services Conceptual Framework, Nature's Contribution to People. So this was given in 2015 by Diaz et al. And there are 6 interlinked elements constituting a socio-ecological system that operates at various spatio-temporal scales. So while Millennium Ecosystem Assessment talked mostly about ecological system, the IBIS conceptual framework of nature's contribution to people talks about socio-ecological system. So this includes nature as the first interlinked element, nature's benefits to people the second one. It also talks about anthropogenic assets, it talks about institutions and governance systems that are indirect drivers to change. It also talks about direct drivers of change. So these are natural drivers, anthropogenic driver. So for example, climate change, invasive species, land use change, urbanization, so on and so forth are important direct drivers of change. And last but not the least, it talks about good quality of life. When we talk about interdisciplinary approach of ecosystem valuation or accounting, we need to understand that it is drawn from different subjects. So the first one is ecology, understanding of how ecosystem processes and functions and structure are. It also is about understanding the basic concept of economics that we are covering under this module. Then it also includes national accounts. And last but not the least, the fourth pillar is statistical measurements for ecosystem accounting. But still the larger question is remaining, and this larger question is why to value? Why do we need to value ecosystem services and ecosystem processes? Now we need to understand how much an ecosystem contributes to economic activity or society, because unless and until we give it a value, there are chances that we will deplete them or we will destroy them or we will use them without understanding the true benefits and the true values of these ecosystems. We also need to understand that the benefit and cost of an intervention that alters this ecosystem, especially conservation investment, developmental project, regulation or incentive, so that we can ensure that ecosystem goods and services are comparable with different kind of investment. So this also helps us to understand and make a judicious choice of what kind of investment we want to have for nature. The third important aspect of why we need to value ecosystems and ecosystem services is that how are the costs and benefits going to change the ecosystem distributed? What kind of impact it is going to have? So this is another dimension of why we need to value. And the most important aspect of this valuation exercise and learning this approach is how to make conservation a financially sustainable approach. So these are some of the important reasons that why we need to understand and ensure that we want to value an ecosystem. Now comes the another aspect and component of environmental externalities. I am sure you might have heard this word somewhere during the discussion or in the news. or somewhere else. So basically, an externality is a spillover that effect and its effect that are associated with production or consumption that extends to a third party outside the market. So there are basically two types of environmental externalities. One is a negative externality, where an external effect generates cost to a third party, whereas a positive externality is an external effect that generates benefits to a third party. Now, for example, dumping of toxic waste in ocean by industries or emitting gases by industries into local airspace is going to be a negative externality for people living in coastal areas or people living in the areas closer to the industry. So that's kind of a negative externality. EPA toxic release inventory is very much important. The Environmental Protection Agency or EPA takes stock of these toxic releases. Now we also need to understand that externalities caused by doing something we want to do, produce or consume is an important component. So when we talk about positive externality, I can give you an example of walking to a work that reduces congestion, because you are not taking car to the workplace, that is reducing one vehicle on the road, and it is also reducing the possibility of congestion. So to third party, it's basically a positive externality. When I take it with the point of view of negative externality, for example, I take a air travel to reduce the time of traveling, but at the same time for third party, it is basically an approach that will enhance air pollution. So this is the way you need to understand what environmental externalities are and how we can understand positive and negative externalities. So we need to understand another important aspect, that is lack of protection of ecosystem services by a market failure or regulation. What is a market failure? We know that many ecosystem services are public goods, so that means they are available to all. But their values cannot be captured by providers in free markets. We know that ecosystem benefits and services are very valuable. We cannot put a value to them. But still we have created few markets, for example, wetlands and endangered species, to ensure that we put a certain value to them and we ensure their protection, because that is how the present world understands market and market-based benefits for everything that is tradable, its possibility to conserve them as well. There was another approach that I would like to discuss here is institutional failure. Now we know that institution means policies, governance approaches and institutions that do not sufficiently encourage and manage ecosystem provision. So ecological boundaries don't meet and match political boundaries. These are mostly the services that are in transboundary areas as well. So extending the institutional boundaries beyond traditional reach is one of the political difficulty, and that also leads to institutional failure to conserve these ecosystems. Again the question, why ecosystem accounts? We understand there is a concept of externality. We also gave an understanding on ecosystem valuation and also market failure and institutional failure. But still, why ecosystem accounts? So one thing is very clear, it helps us to give information for tracking changes in ecosystem to better understand degradation. It is also providing us information that can help us link with changes to human activities and human well-being. It also provides us and extends the scope of our information for analysis of impacts on diverse environments. So that includes and thus ultimately on societies as well. Ecosystem accounts also provides us information on ecosystem services and trade-offs, and especially the co-benefits involved. So that means ecosystem inputs and assets, when given human inputs, are going to benefit and provide goods and services that are going to provide human well-being. That's why ecosystem accounting has to be in place. Now, in this context, it's also important to understand the spatial units. The statistical unit of ecosystem accounting are spatial areas. So, these are considered under spatial units. So, there are three important types of these spatial units. The first one is basic spatial unit or BSU. The second one is the land cover or ecosystem functional unit, that is called as LCEU. Now again, this land cover ecosystem functional unit has been categorized into two different parts. The first one is provisional classification provided in ecosystem accounting, and the second one is, and the third one is ecosystem accounting unit or EAU, that is based on purpose of analysis. So we know that now we have three kind of units: basic spatial unit, then land cover ecosystem unit, and ecosystem accounting units. But again, like any other subject and any other method, there are applicability criteria and also limitations of ecosystem valuation. The first and important one is that ecosystem valuation highlights cost and benefits, and these cost bearers and beneficiaries that in the past have so far been ignored. So this is one of the important aspects, that we have to have a very inclusive kind of approach to value ecosystems. Second, ecosystem valuation only provides a set of tools with which to make better and more informed decisions, so that there is a no standalone exercise. There are different methods to make approach for ecosystem valuation for decision making that is evidence based. Another important criteria and understanding applicability and limitation is that valuation is out of necessary partial. It is out of the necessity and it is partial, because there are case studies where we underestimate ecosystem values at larger scale, because larger scale it is more difficult to replace ecosystem goods and services, and their interaction are so complex that it is very, very tough to understand impacts of alternative. So that's why these ecosystem values are not necessarily complete, they are partial. The fourth important reason is some ecosystem will never be measurable or quantifiable because we do not have necessary scientific, technical or economic data. For example, we do a lot of evaluation for marine ecosystem, but there are certain depths we know about these values, but we don't know about the values or deeper layers of oceans or deeper depths of ocean. So there will never be a quantifiable or measurable approach to this. Now there are some more limitations and economic valuation. For example, when ecosystem benefit that relate an attribute such as human life, culture or religious significance, ecosystem valuation or economic valuation raises a serious ethical questions. Then ecosystem valuation can be considered dangerous when it only focuses on financial or cash benefits and does not capture the true benefits and values that should not be valued. For example, the psychological benefits linked with when we visit a natural park, national park, or a high altitude mountain or coastal area and deserts. So these kind of values can never be captured truly. Results of ecosystem valuation studies are not definite, and these are transferable between groups and location. They are generally based on the perception of a particular group at one point of time, and it is or may not be universally true and valid. So that's again a bigger limitation of this. One important limitation is also that there is no guarantee that the findings of economic valuation will support wise use or management of resources. So that's one of the bigger limitation to this. While we have the value, we will not be able to ensure that it is mainstreamed and ensures a safe and judicial management of ecosystem and ecosystem services. In fact, the use of valuation studies to identify and promote new ways of capturing ecosystem values through market or payment of ecosystem service can sometimes be also a double-edged sword. You know that payment of ecosystem service is a conservation incentive that is paid to the community who have been the custodians and have been managing and conserving these resources for decades and generations. Now, it is also clear that these are different ways how ecosystem valuation have helped. For example, in India, we know there have been so many approaches to value ecosystem services. The Tiger Capital, the Tiger Sanctuary Valuation by Dr. Madhu Verma, the Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand Ecosystem Services Value by Dr. Madhu Verma. Then we have better approaches that have helped policy enabling. For example, studies from Vietnam have helped policy enabling payments for forest environmental services to community. Japan has used ecosystem valuation as a national strategy to conserve ecosystem services. China has also used various eco-compensation progress in place by using this approach of ecosystem valuation. Countries in Europe have been targeting no net loss of ecosystem through this approach. Another examples come from United Kingdom, where action plan to embed ecosystem services into policy has related to decision making and help better decision making progress. Norway has used deep study, the economics of ecology and biodiversity, that was given by one of the Indian economists, Dr. Pawan Sukhdev. There are studies in France where calculating reference values for in-country ecosystem have been one of the strategies to ensure better decision making. United Nations have also ensured different documents on this, and I'm sure you are aware that there is a significant progress being made in this domain in last few decades. In countries in North America, especially United States of America, Forest Services rules include ecosystem services in planning by using a ecosystem valuation approach. South America, Colombia has been using regulations to enable watershed by using payment of ecosystem services. Brazil is using 2 states that are established as a legal framework for payment of ecosystem services program. So there are a huge lot of development appearing and happening across the world, even in developing and underdeveloped countries of Africa, especially like Botswana. Exploring natural capital accounting has been very much in place. In Kenya, Information Valuation Conference has recently held, and this has also ensured that it also takes into picture this economic valuation approach for evidence-based decision making. There is a huge global momentum and consensus of the relevance and benefits of ecosystem valuation, and this has been very much in place. So if I want to summarize the session for today, I think there are some important aspects that we have discussed. What are ecosystems? What are ecosystem services? What is nature's contribution to people framework given by Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity in Ecosystem Services? We also talked about why to value, why to ecosystem concepts for valuation and accounting. We also talked about externalities, both positive and negative externalities. We talked about market failure and institutional failure, and we also talked broadly upon the applicability and limitations of ecosystem accounting with a clear perspective of how it can help evidence-based decision making with examples from different parts of this world. Thank you so much, and we'll be taking an interesting session soon in the future. Thank you.